Hello, I'm Doug Doherty, President of Hamilton Flourishing. We're so glad you've joined us today. We're going to have a discussion today about one of the issues that is probably the most important, not only in Hamilton County, but in the whole nation. If you thought that there was something that was holding back a great many children from thriving and flourishing in life, and you could do something about it, would you? Well, what we're going to be talking about today is K through 3 literacy. And we'll be talking about it in terms of local in Hamilton County and state and national. And we have a Professor Lucien Ellington, Dr. Lucien Ellington here with us today, who is the UC Foundation Professor of Education. And Lucien and I have become friends, and I have just become totally convinced that this is one of the top issues facing our community and that we absolutely have to do something about it. And the interesting thing about that is that you can do something about this. So we're going to be talking about that today. So Lucien, thank you for coming. Welcome for being here.
It's a pleasure, Doug. And I'm so appreciative that Hamilton Flourishing is paying attention to this. I think it's the most critical problem in K-12 education. It's not a conservative Republican problem. It's not a liberal Democrat problem. It is an educational problem. And everyone, or a large number of people, are hurt. Children, as long as it continues.
Can you tell us, when we talk about K through 3 literacy, can you tell us exactly what we're talking about?
Well, we have two groups of experts on this topic. We have our alleged experts. We have people who are teachers, and the majority of them are trained in colleges of education. And we have cognitive scientists, and they usually don't talk with each other. But the larger point is, the science is settled about how to improve early literacy. But too often, most public schools and many private schools use romantic notions of teaching early literacy that are ineffective. And
are you saying, Lucien, that there's kind of an old-fashioned way of teaching reading that's not effective, that's pervasive across the country, and that there are very recent, in the last 10 years, kind of research about brain development and things like that that show the science of reading, and they're different?
That is a good general way of describing the situation.
Okay.
But most elementary teachers are taught that if young children are surrounded by good books with pictures, that they can learn to read. It's a great idea to have good books that children can access. But one of the biggest scientific, and I use that word deliberately and again, findings, is that one does not have to teach a child to talk. Every person must be taught to read. And just having books around that are interesting is very insufficient.
The way that's been explained to me is that we're hardwired to talk. I mean, it's just part of how we're wired. You throw a baby in a room full of people who are talking, and in several months they'll be talking. Reading is not that way. Reading is something that has to be taught. It's a skill that has to be learned. And there's several aspects to that, learning to read well.
And I think you're correct. And I think it's important to look at national, state, and local data, and this is not new data, this problem, this early literacy problem, I think that the average well-educated American doesn't realize the extent of the crisis, and that's what I call it. Let me give you one national example. There is the National Assessment of Educational Progress, approved by the Congress in the last century. It is the nation's report card, and it measures every year now how well students read when they begin the fourth grade.
Which is important because historically it was explained this way, and this is an oversimplification. The first few years of school, you're learning to read. But in fourth grade, you're reading to learn. So it's very important that you get, once you cross that river, that open that door, that you're able to read, because after that it's built on all the reading. That's sort of right, isn't it?
It is, but I would say that from kindergarten, students need an academic curriculum at their level, of course, because it begins to build the knowledge. But just to give viewers an example of how bad it is from the National Assessment for Educational Progress, the state that perpetually leads the nation in the percentage of students who can read after the third grade at proficiency level or higher is Massachusetts. The fall 2019 data indicates that, and this is the state leader for the nation, only 45% of Massachusetts beginning fourth graders could read at the proficiency level or higher.
Wow. And they spend like $20,000 per student or something like that.
And I do not believe it is primarily a money problem. And by the way, the interesting thing about this situation is if one looks at the national average for the National Assessment of Educational Progress nationwide, only 34% all over the nation. So you see it's lower than Massachusetts, but only 34% of kids starting the fourth grade can read at a proficiency level or higher. You want to discuss the state of Tennessee and Hamilton County.
Yes.
Those numbers are basically the national average on NAEP, 32%. So they're right around at 33%. So Tennessee tracks, it tracks what the national average is. But what we're talking about here, I know everyone here has gone to school, but try to convert this into actual grades. What we're saying is if a student can't read at a proficiency level or higher, they're way below average in reading. So no state, I should say, is getting above right now 45%.
That's horrible. It's a national disgrace, and somebody we're raising a flag. We're saying something needs to be done. And in Hamilton County, basically a third of the students are prepared. And 2/3, 2 out of every 3 students are not prepared in Hamilton County.
And the state of Tennessee. And again, I would say it's really interesting that Hamilton County and the state of Tennessee, that they're very close to the national average on that. Tennessee's not the worst state. You can get into the 20s.
This may get a little outside your cockpit, but what happens in a life of a person who is not learning to read? What push them down to 18, 19 years old, 20 years old? What's their life? Is it significantly different? Has anybody ever followed this?
And this is what, and I don't want to overload viewers with statistics, but this is what makes this a crisis. If a student cannot read at the proficiency level or higher at the beginning of fourth grade, the odds are about 10% they'll ever be a proficiency level reader or higher. So we're graduating seniors in high school, and again, nationally, state, and locally, those averages aren't compiled every year by the federal government, but they are about 45% of all seniors. So that's not including all the students who have dropped out of school because of reading. Because if one can't read, one will have academic problems with other subjects. It's the ultimate gateway skill.
And the problems with, now let me see if I follow this right. Did you just say that the 12th graders, only about 10% of them on a national average are proficient?
I know I said about 45%
okay.
are at proficiency level or higher. But that does not include all the students that have dropped out because of academic problems. And this is reaching the college level now. Colleges and universities, approximately 1/3 of students who enter have reading difficulties.
The studying that I've done on this, I found out that the word proficiency is a key word. Can you just kind of elaborate on what an educator means when he says somebody is proficient at something? Because to the listener, you need to understand this, because people talk about improvements, but that's not the same thing as proficient. And so can you kind of talk about what it means to be proficient at something? How would a fifth grade reader, how would he be proficient?
A fifth grade reader would be proficient, have the vocabulary, have the phonics skills, have the spelling, have the grammar to be able to successfully negotiate. Not necessarily be the best student, but grade level material. And then there's advanced. I mentioned it a couple of times, but proficiency or advanced. So there are 4 levels. Basic is not good enough. Basic means a person is not illiterate, but they don't have the skill set as they advance in the grades to learn more.
Talk some more about this literacy thing. We've talked a little bit about K through 3 a little bit. How does it move? How does it move? How do the statistics move through school after that point?
Students who aren't at the proficiency level or higher entering the 4th grade continue to struggle. Continue as content gets more complex to make poorer grades, and so that's a problem. But what is so frustrating is that cognitive scientists, now I need to introduce that term. These are the experts who study how people learn. Short-term memory, long-term memory, and cognitive scientists usually have degrees in neurology. They can be MDs, they can be educational psychologists. But the cognitive scientists have known since before the turn of the century. In fact, the turn of the century is a significant year because there were reading wars. And the Congress established a national reading panel, and it was made up of cognitive scientists. And they overwhelmingly proved in 2000 that there are better ways to teach reading than what most public and many private schools use. Yet this has been resisted by the K-12. It's a combination, and I don't mean this in a negative term, but I have a doctoral degree in education. I never studied anything about cognitive science. I'd never heard about it. I'm grateful that I found out about it, and I don't have the time to talk about it, but that was about a decade ago. But the average aspiring teacher never takes a course, or rarely, in how people actually learn. A number of the pedagogy courses for aspiring teachers, especially reading, they tend to have a romantic perspective. Children can learn to love to read if you put, and I mentioned this earlier, but just surround them with books. I just read a statistic last week from Education Week that 20% of elementary school teachers believe you don't even need to teach a student to read. But even the ones who do aren't using, for the most part, effective methods. And we know what can be used. We have enough examples from public school districts and private schools and charter schools of what works.
Talk about just a minute, the ingredients for good literacy training. Like we've talked about phonics. Sometimes people talk about phonics, whole word, and they get arguments and stuff. But I've heard you talk about it, and it's more complex and nuanced than that.
The best way to think of learning to read is to think of learning a code. It's not a simple code. One must listen to words and their pronunciations. One must learn phonics. And one must learn to spell correctly and learn vocabulary and grammar. So it's all mixed together. And here's a great example of what not to do. Teachers today in so-called balanced literacy programs that usually they're supposed to have phonics and good books around children too, but they have very little phonics. It's not systematic as a rule. And so a student in the first grade is looking at a book, or the second grade. The student sees a horse. The student goes, pony. The teacher goes, that's correct. First of all, pony is not correct. Pony and horse are two different words. But teachers are encouraged to let students just look at pictures and learn vocabulary. And I think it's important to mention this. To teach people reading effectively, there are three things that are needed. Phonics, systematic phonics are needed, but that's not enough. There needs to also be a rich academic curriculum from kindergarten on, at the children's levels, in every one of the subjects. Why is that? Because students are learning and getting into their long-term memory important vocabulary words in those different subjects like science or history and geography or literature or math. They're getting those foundational vocabulary words in their long-term memory. Then they're positioned to learn more as they advance.
Mm-hmm. I was trying to explain this to somebody, and tell me if I was right using this as an example. I said, if you didn't know what a hippopotamus was, and you took phonics, or you were in a phonics class, and you learned how to pronounce hippopotamus, but you didn't know what a hippopotamus was, you wouldn't have any place to put it in your brain. There'd be no context for hippopotamus. So it's kind of a wasted opportunity without that rich curriculum proceeding or being blended into, maybe blend is not the right word, but being mixed in with this rest of the
You're
stuff.
absolutely right. If you're in a content-rich curriculum and you're a young child, you'll learn that Africa has a disproportionately high amount of hippopotamuses. You'll see a picture of a hippopotamus. You'll learn how to pronounce the word and maybe spell the word. So you see the combination.
Wow.
And it's really impossible to improve early literacy without those three factors. But may I say an optimistic thing?
Yes,
we
sir.
don't want to be too
Yes, sir.
pessimistic. What is so interesting right now, and I have really only been studying this problem intensely for about 3 years, although I have a long background in education. But more and more states are beginning to pay attention to this.
Oh, this is interesting. Yeah, share this.
And whether these are the right decisions or not, but several states, including some Alabama, California, and Mississippi, those are different places, but they've realized that a majority of students are moving to the fourth grade and they are not competent readers. So there's legislation that's been passed recently in Mississippi, maybe 3 years ago, Alabama this year. But if a student is not at proficiency level or higher by the end of the third grade, they are not promoted. Now that can have some problems, unintended consequences, but what I see is it shows more and more people are learning about this issue, and that's good.
Well, and somebody has to say, we're going to do it this way, whether it's a school board or a superintendent or a state legislature or somebody's got to say, we're going to do it a different way. At least somewhere along the line that has to be. And one of the things I want to encourage our listeners to do is to make this a point of conversation with your friends. Is it right? Is it a good thing? Is it healthy for the children? Is it good for the progress of our community that only 1 out of 3 are literate or reading ready at 4th grade? Because the problems that follow them from then on is they're not learning, they're falling further behind. Then you look into things like poverty, and you look into things like joblessness, and you look into things like criminal behavior. And I don't want to make any broad general statements, but it doesn't look good for the life of the child going through a life without learning to read. And their earning potential is way down, so as a taxpayer, they're not contributing. The weight on the state becomes more. It's a big deal. So I'm asking you, as someone who's viewing this program right now, this report on early literacy is on our website, hamiltonflourishing.org. And I think they're going to put that on the screen. But you'll be able to go there and read this report. There's a PowerPoint presentation, and there's a longer presentation about this. We think this is a big issue. We're going to be pushing this all year long, and as far as we can. We want the citizens of Hamilton County, this is Hamilton Flourishing speaking, to know about this issue and to know that our children need to come first. They need to learn to read, because it's a key to so much of life, and without it, it's a handicap. So, Lucien, thank you for sharing 40 plus years of experience as an educator. Thank you for being here today, and thank you for caring about this and the children that it represents.
And thank you also in Hamilton Flourishing for publishing our article, which my co-author, Professor Cody Cooper, and we look at it as a civil rights issue too, because the poor children and minority children are often more severely impacted by this. But what viewers can find in that article, viewers can even find a true-false test by reading it. They can find the tools to go to their own school and learn how reading is taught or maybe mistaught.
And the longer article, I will tell you this, has all the sources listed, so you can go look it up yourself if you don't believe what's being told you. So thank you today for listening to another edition of Hamilton Flourishing.